Hello and welcome to the Alt Asset Allocation podcast. Today's interview is with Lakshman Achuthan. Business cycles, economic cycles, it all seems so obvious in hindsight, but cycles are easier said than done in terms of predicting. I love having conversations like this, and we're just trying to pull ourselves out of the paralysis by overanalysis of all the minutia and answer. Is the wind in our face or at our back? Looking at these historical cycles and leading indicators, currently, right now, the question is, are we in a bear market rally or is this actually at the start of a new bull market? Obviously, with all of my interviews, we're not focusing on the short-term tactical moves, but more so thinking super long-term on these things and positioning your portfolios hopefully accordingly. Lakshman is a student of business cycles for nearly a century at this point with Economic Cycle Research Institute, or ECRI. Highly recommend check out their reports. It's really good stuff. But Lakshman himself really, really knows his stuff about cycles. Before you listen, please don't forget to like or subscribe to the podcast, or even better, leave a review. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel and or give the video a thumbs up. These things really, really help with awareness, and I really appreciate it. All right, enjoy this episode with Lakshman on all things cycles. Lakshman, good to see you. Welcome to the Alt Asset Allocation podcast. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you. Good to see you too. It's been a minute and a lot's been going on.
It has, and I was looking back. So episode 43 in April 2021. So for my listeners, I'll link this in the show notes, but that was a great episode. We talked about what are business cycles, economic cycles, why they're important. But since then, obviously, a lot has changed. It's now mid-August 2022. It is weird times now, as it was then. You, as you say, are a student of the business cycle. You're a big picture guy, which I really, really appreciate, versus getting stuck in the minutia of day-to-day short-termism. But I want to start off just by asking, where are we in the business cycle? Is this a risk on, risk off, upswing, downswing? Where are we in the cycle right now?
Sure. And just to set that table again, we spoke in spring of 21. Right. So that's perfect in a way, because right there, April, May of 2021 was as good as it gets in terms of growth. And I'm sure we were talking about that, and I should go back and take a listen again, where we're always looking forward. That's the coincident. I'm saying as good as it gets in terms of coincident snapshot. If we took a Polaroid or whatever for your older listeners, took a snapshot of what was going on then, double-digit growth rates in the growth stuff. Inflation was on its way up, but probably not totally out of control just yet. And everybody was quite optimistic about everything. And our forward-looking data, I'm sure, was moving down, deteriorating at that point. In retrospect, looking back in the rearview mirror, it's crystal clear that output, even jobs, okay, we could talk about that, sales and income have been decelerating from very lofty levels. So we've been in, to your question, just to open up, where are we? Okay, we're in a slowdown. And this slowdown has now been a long time coming, right? That's spring of 21 is a long time ago. So that slowdown's continuing. And every time you're in a slowdown, it resolves in one or two ways. It's a hard landing or a soft landing. Everybody hopes for a soft landing. We all want one. Let's just stipulate that. But you don't always get what you wish for. And I'm afraid, just to set up this discussion today, I'm afraid the odds are pretty high. We're cruising for a bruising. We're looking for a hard landing here in our forward-looking data. Because when we're looking for signs of a soft landing, what we mean by that is we need to see our forward-looking data on growth stabilizing from its decline and starting to turn and go the other way. The drivers of the economy turning and going the other way. That has yet to happen. So there's more slowing ahead, and we're already dealing with some declines in the levels of things that kind of define the economy outside your window. And when you get declining levels, I'm not talking growth rates, I just switched from growth rates to levels. When you get declining levels, that's the kind of stuff that describes a recession. So there's been all this talk about the negative GDP. That itself doesn't describe a recession. It's often associated with recession. We said technically it's a necessary but insufficient kind of statistic to see around a recession. You really need to see jobs growth also go negative, and we don't have that yet. And we may not have that right away, although year-over-year jobs growth is decelerating. And just to wrap up on the kind of where are we snapshot of this slowdown that's likely to end in a soft landing. Why? How do we get here? Just to recap real quick, we had the crazy COVID recession, the shutdowns, the basically policymakers in the West really went for it with stimulus. And then the economy's opening up. So you have this super strong upturn. And I'm talking about both monetary and fiscal stimulus. And it's basically the countries in the West. Some countries didn't do it quite the same. China took a slightly different path. Japan did much less in terms of the stimulus. You see a little less inflation in those countries as a result of a slightly different policy path, perhaps. The difficulty with the policy path that the Western economies in the United States took is that you have inflation. Okay, so that's the headline. Everybody's painfully aware of that. You borrow from future demand, right? You get everybody jazzed up to do stuff. And we respond to that, right? And as human beings in the market economy. And that's pulling a lot of future demand forward, which then if you take a break from that, contributes to the slowdown of the recession. Lots of funny stuff in the supply chains, which really jerks around the producers around the world because they don't fully understand. Some of them don't fully understand the cycle. And so there's like, whoa, there's so much demand. Let me build it. They will come. And then all of a sudden nobody's buying stuff and they've got overcapacity and you've got to correct for that. So we're doing that. And then in the meantime, you still got to make policy, right? Or business decisions or whatever. Business people and investors, they're figuring it out. I think they're a little wise to what's happening and adjusting to it. In a way, I'm a little more worried about the policymakers because I don't know if how they're doing. The fiscal stuff is got a lot of politics in it, and on the monetary side, you have really a lack of a framework. They're kind of in a way blowing in the wind and maybe reacting a bit to market sentiment and whatnot. So it's not a very cohesive policy framework right now in terms of monetary policy. And let me just leave it there. I dumped a lot out there. You can take it in any direction.
There's a lot of directions we can go here. And I think the biggest thing is, you've been a student of history and studying history for a long time, and your institute has been very good at predicting recessions based on like historical cycles. But I hear all the time that this is unprecedented and, the government, their backs up against the wall. So just thinking like, how much can we learn from previous cycles and previous instances, periods of history versus like, we're in uncharted territories at this point, right? And like, we're kind of creating the history as we go along. I mean, how do you kind of like balance these things?
Yeah, we are in kind of new territory in that sense. I mean, people talk about, is this the 70s? Is probably the easiest one because we hear about the story of structural inflation in the 70s.
I've also heard
But
the 40s and like,
these
pick your
moments of,
time
yeah,
period, right?
you go back and you see where inflation ran up and you say, oh, maybe it's like that. So one lesson, right? So I'm learning from my own experience. I've been doing this real time professionally since 1990, where we've had some upswings in inflation, but not like huge inflations. And of course, my mentor, Jeffrey Moore, who is the father of leading indicators, and then he's certainly recounting to me his mentor Wesley Mitchell's work since the 20s. So I'm kind of familiar with about a century or so. And look, stuff has changed, right? And because of that experience, both my own and through my teachers, um, it's taught us really not to forecast by analogy too much, rather to look at leading indicators. And I want to get to the future inflation gauge in a moment, because while some key conditions may seem similar to past episodes, other really important factors can be completely different from the 70s or the 40s, right? And so on the cyclical side of things, if we keep it to the cyclical side as opposed to structural, where we can monitor the key factors that drive the inflation cycles, and we can see, is it heading to the upside or to the downside cyclically, which is looking at several quarters, not many years. On the structural side of things, I could say right away things are very different from the past several decades. Number one, that's really important because the Fed's operating in a new environment. And number two, it's that includes the 70s. I mean, we've got massive demographic shifts, very different from those earlier decades. And that's not just within the United States, but it's globally, which also washes onto our shores. Okay? Number one, that's a structural thing. It's different than those past decades. You've got deglobalization. I think everybody who hears the word right now is like, oh, okay, everybody's starting to fight. And so the supply chain stuff is over onshoring and this and that. But actually, it started without a fight. It just was naturally starting deglobalization about a decade ago. Okay, this is not new. So we think it is a structural shift. Hard to forecast a structural shift. You can kind of see them after you're in them. And here we are a decade into, I think, a bit of a shift of deglobalizing. And you could see that when you look at the ratio of global trade to global GDP. You could see that happening. Then, come to current events, meaning like since 17, 18, something like that, 2017, 18, we've been getting into kind of Cold War 2.0. And how does that interact with deglobalization forces that were already going on? So these are all impacting the structural inflation table. And then you've got the big player and the elephant in the room or whatever, which is the policy response, in particular the Fed, which leads a lot of other central banks. And I'll just say, and look, I'm not Fed bashing in the sense of, I don't just enjoy beating up on them, but this is important stuff. And they made a really, really, really epic policy mistake. And what do they do now in the wake of that? Do they, because it may reinforce or push back against some of these structural forces that are affecting inflation. So, the 70s are kind of neat. Neat in the sense that, we had inflation up. It was averaging, I think, 7% or so, right, for the decade. In contrast to, say, the post Great Recession, where it was averaging like 2%, right? So you got structurally 7% or 2%. That's big difference. Okay. But the cycles are happening in both instances, right? And you never know. Well, the market never knows. I think we have a sense. The market gets confused when there's a cyclical turn inside of those periods. So in the 70s, you had cycles in inflation around that average of 7%. You can get to a high of 13%. We were at a high of 9, right? So we're in that area. And you had a low of 3%. Now, that's a 10% gap, okay? And I don't think people really think about that too much when they think the 70s. They're just like, yeah, it was high.
Yeah.
But no, it was going like that. So it feels to me like volatility is a feature that we're going to be navigating. That may mean kind of this rebirth of macro to a degree. It was only a year ago. I mean, when we were talking, it was death of macro.
Macro was dead. Oh yeah,
macro was dead. So this could be the flip side of that kind of feeling for the market.
Yeah, I just always feel myself, I use the word feel because it's like, it's just kind of this gut feeling, but like demographics, globalization, deglobalization, and then like living within the exponential age of technological improvements, and then coupled with like potential monetary regime changes and things like that. It's like, man, it does feel different this time. But it's still investor psychology, and it's still humans making these decisions, which drives a lot of this the cycles, I would imagine, right?
100%, right? So, and we were, we've talked about this, and forgive me if I'm repeating myself, right? But there's this we write about this physics envy, right? That economists have. Sorry, and like math or physics or programming or whatever, that you're going to, in some other hard sciences, that you're going to get some precision. And maybe big data will give us precision. There's AI is going to give us precision also. But the factor, to your point, is kind of how you're feeling, right? So, I mean, not in a literal model building sort of way. We don't employ models to forecast cycles. We monitor indicators. But I'd say, roughly a third of the inputs that are going in that are capturing the drivers of the cycle do relate to feelings, which are, if I oversimplify them, fear and greed. And that is what keeps us going, right? I mean, it keeps us from getting our cut off at the knees, the fear, and then it lets us make hay for a rainy day, the greed, right? And you just have to have some way of managing that, not letting it get out of control in terms of your own decision making, and that's where, in an applied way, right, instead of the theoretical way, how can you use cycles to help you out? And so it's not market timing, right? I know there's a lot of time and money invested in saying that market timing is a horrible, dirty word because it doesn't serve certain agendas where you just want to feed the beast and buy and hold. But bad things happen during recessions. I think we can stipulate that. And you tend to get problems with earnings and so on and so forth. And you also get those during growth rate cycle slowdowns. And those have been mitigated to a degree by the policy of easy money, which has truncated the persistence of the market reaction during slowdowns. But you could only get away with that policy when there's no inflation. Now that there's inflation, we're in a seemingly, at least for now, in a new world.
Yeah, indeed. And let's double click a bit on inflation. Yep. I tweeted some questions, and like a lot of them center around inflation outlook, like where it's going, how long it's going to be here, because this is the headline today is inflation moderates in July. CPI rises at less than expected 8.5%. This would seem bananas 2 years ago that we're like happy about 8.5%. So inflation's on a lot of people's minds. Would love to hear your longer term expectations on inflation, where we are, stagflation, any of the other
Sure.
terms that are relevant in this situation.
Sure. Well, right now, look, I think the cyclical peak is behind us. Okay. And the question is how, but that doesn't mean you don't feel inflation, okay, just because there's technically a cyclical peak behind you. How long is inflation going to kind of plague the economy? That remains to be seen. It's probably going to be there for a bit. Um, but I want to, again, orient everybody to what goes on with inflation. Most of the economic thinking in the world, okay, is that there's some sort of construct of a model of the economy and X amount of growth, and here's the inflation, and here's the jobs. And they are kind of tethered together, okay? So if one moves, then the other moves. And that's how models work. You add this up and you get this equation that's going to spit out a number. And then that's where some of those numbers come from. The estimate was this, and it beat the estimate, or it didn't, or whatever. Look, at the end of the day, inflation's still really high, regardless of that headline and regardless of the beat. It's way too high. I remember that guy, there's a guy in New York. He always runs, I think, for mayor. He's like, the rent is too damn high. That's the only thing he says. And this is, so he's probably got I don't know where he is right now. He's probably saying that.
Well, I'll tell you what, man. I my favorite place in Venice is a breakfast burrito stop, and it's a truck, and the price has gone up now like 25% since.
Yeah.
And I'm like, come on, guys, what the heck?
Yeah, it's too
it.
damn high. The price of the burrito is too damn high. That's what everybody is doing. What we're doing is totally different, right? We're looking at cycles. And so there's cycles in growth. We talked about recession for a second. We can get back to that. There's cycles in inflation, which are related but different. And then there's cycles, there's actually cycles in employment. So in the wake of the stagflation of the 70s, I'm going to give you a quick history here. My late mentor, Jeffrey Moore, and he's the father of leading indicators, literally, okay, recognized that inflation cycles were different from business cycles. Okay, you cannot equate these two things. And that was 40 years ago. All right, ever since we've been working on kind of what are the forward-looking indicators specific to the inflation cycle. Now, a lot of that's proprietary, but we do share this one of these outputs with clients, which is the future inflation gauge. And it's designed specifically, just like leading indicators lead the business cycle, future inflation gauge leads inflation cycle turning points. And the value of that work is really big. So in the summer of 16, when yields were at multi-year lows, inflation cycle, the FIG was going to the upside. It was moving up. Really good call. The next really big one, which is impactful today, was in 2018, when the Fed was in the middle of a rate hike cycle in 2018. And the bond gurus were out, they have bond kings and whatever, and they were saying, look, it's going to be 4%, 5% 10-year, maybe even higher. Bear market in the bonds is here to stay. And of course, we're monitoring, right? We don't have any agenda here. The future inflation gauge goes, boom, the other way, and it makes a cyclical downturn, right? And we were trying to figure out, we understood what was going on as we were watching that. But the Fed kept raising rates. And it raised rates in September and December of 18. Then the market just puked. And Powell just said, screw it, and went the other way in January of 19. And that's the Powell pivot. And guess what we're waiting for now, right? We're like, hey, can you do that again? That's kind of
another pivot, please.
Can you do that again? So look, it's dangerous. I understand the market's got to get excited and go for that, and they, whoever knows, I don't know exactly what the market's doing, but for the Fed for a second here, right? They ought to kind of diagnose. I mean, any of us, if we kind of crack something up, would be like, how'd that happen? I don't want to do that again, right? You kind of learn from your mistakes. I'm afraid here they kind of learned the wrong lesson. They said, oh gosh, maybe there was a structural downshift in inflation. And that's why we didn't understand it. And maybe the Phillips curve, which is kind of this old idea they have about jobs and inflation, is that maybe it's even flatter than our models said it was. And so therefore, we really don't have to get excited about inflation at all. And that set the stage for what they just didn't do, which is react to, let alone predict, the inflation that we're having right now, right? Which doesn't seem, again, like to the non-economists, it's like, yeah, duh, right?
Well,
But
also in hindsight, right? It's
also
it's
in
very easy
hindsight,
to,
but I think,
well, duh, those signs were there.
but also in hindsight, but it's hard to wrap your brain around the order of magnitude of stimulus, right? What's a few billion or trillion among friends, right? It's like billion, trillion. You don't really get the difference.
Which is
But
the
there is a
craziest
difference.
thing to, yeah, I mean, this is the thing is people like, humans don't understand exponential growth. You like fold a piece of paper 30 times and it reaches the moon, and it's like, what?
Right. Yeah,
Like,
they
so these
don't.
numbers of magnitude are very, very different things, but it's so big that it doesn't make any sense anyways.
Very different. And so the fig now, in the current stuff we're dealing with now, the fig turned up. I mean, I kind of cringe saying this, in the fall of 2020, right? Well ahead of, there was a surge in break-evens, which is a market kind of measure of inflation expectations in early 21. And of course, the Fed didn't even start doing anything until earlier this year, right? Because they just didn't get it. So now, the fig ran all the way up to a 33-year high. Inflation went to it's a directional indicator. Inflation went to a 40 some odd year high. The fig has peaked and rolled over. So directionally, I think the peak is in inflation is in, but it's going to stay uncomfortably high for now. And there's, you get some relief in the goods inflation, you get some relief in the gas. I don't know about food, maybe not yet. Right, the burritos are still up.
Damn.
I saw white bread was still up today. But I'd rather have a burrito. But the sticky stuff is going to keep edging up. It may not even, it's still moving to the upside. So hard to pivot, right? If you think about it, January 19, you pivot, the market puked 20%, inflation was low, you pivot. Okay, because it's like the game book they've been using since the Great Recession. But now you still have inflation at 8%. How do you pivot there? It's a little tough. So the forward guidance, maybe this and that, but my sense is it may be premature to say they're going to pivot here. But we'll see.
Curious. Yeah.
He said he wants to be Volcker. He said he wants to be Volcker, but I don't know. I don't know if he can do that.
I'd be curious what your like unpopular or opinion or hot take is on terms of like what that pivot should look like to kind of get us out of this mess or start pointing us in the direction where it would hopefully get us a little more clear.
Well, look, so that structural stuff, the Fed can't really deal with, right? It's not like you lower rates and demographics change. You lower rates or you raise rates and it impacts demographics or geopolitical or Cold War or deglobalization. It doesn't really hit those things, right? What it can hit are the cyclical drivers of growth and inflation with a lag. So the real difficulty is they're just so freaking late that they've got to be stomping on the brakes when the economy is already, tipping into recession. Technically you've got to see jobs growth go negative for that to actually be, for it to be an actual recession. And, that could take still some more time. I mean, our our leading employment indicators and other analysis back in May was telling us that, hey, the unemployment rate's still going to be going down, and you really need that to start moving up if you're going to be in a recession, give or take a few months. And that may not be imminent. It's not here now. So I don't think we're in recession at the moment, unless, we've got some revisions coming up. That always, this is why it's frustrating that you can't just say, I know exactly where I am in economics.
Right.
But the revisions to the data that will help define some of this ultimately, I think we get some glimpse at them at the end of August, and the more clarity in February of next year for what's going on. And these are benchmark revisions, so those could plop some negative growth in there, and we'll be like, wild. Oh yeah, that's behind us.
It's wild. We're just driving, looking down in the rearview mirror, right?
But you listen to, I was at a client kind of thing over last weekend, and some of them, they get, a lot of your guys and ladies who are listening will think about like tech investment, and they're just like, whoa, because the tech stuff is tied to the manufacturing cycle, which tends to be a bigger cycle than the overall economy. And of course, everybody was running hand over foot to buy that stuff a year ago. And if the manufacturers and business managers weren't anticipating this slowdown that we're in, they probably had too much capacity, probably produced too much, and all that, right? So they're sitting there going,
the Peloton guys? They thought that they didn't forecast that this was a spike in demand.
Yeah, no, the Peloton guys, but I think even more extreme. I think the Peloton ones you can kind of think through, but then the ones that may be more impactful, right, for the broad economy, would be, these manufacturers of really integral things. So like one of our clients is a long time. It's a really big chip manufacturer, and they've kind of learned how to ride the cycle. And I think you can apply this to smaller companies too. You don't have to be the big guy to do this. Last year there's a huge boom in chip demand. Everybody's like going crazy. I don't have enough chips. You heard all those stories, right? And being forewarned, kind of among other preparations, they did something kind of interesting this time around. And these cycles happen, every several years. In negotiating with clients who were just like, give me the chips, I'll do anything to get the chips, they wrote in pretty stiff penalties for any cancellations. And so, that forewarning for them is really paying off right now, because a lot of the clients and stuff are just like, oh my God, I can't take anything, don't give it to me, blah blah blah, and I think it's having like 9-figure impacts at this point. And it reminds me, I think there was a quote during the tech recession, the 2001 one. From Chambers at Cisco. Like, the brightest people in the world couldn't have seen this coming, but yeah, it was cyclical. And they had, I think there was even, I don't know where I saw this. I do recall it. I don't think I'm making it up, but that they would put stuff on boats and ship it just to be like, it's gone, but it wasn't going anywhere. Just to get it out, right? Because that's how stuck you are.
Well, I mean, I heard you mention that, like Jeffrey Moore, your mentor, that you're doing extremely well if you can forecasting, if you can spot a recession right when it starts, right? So it's very difficult. Even though we look back at these periods, it's still very, very difficult, because ultimately you don't have a crystal ball.
Super difficult. And then you've got the fear, or the fear and greed, and I guess for investors, if we flip over from companies, C-suites, and we switch over to portfolios, is this a bear market rally, or is it a new bull market? anticipating, in essence, a soft landing. What the heck's going on, right? I'm looking here. I don't know. This is S&P. I have up 1.9% today, 77 points or so, right? So, and that's building on the earlier recovery off the low. So what is it? Which one is it? Now, from our analysis of managing the cycle risk there, bear markets are totally associated with recessions. And we've had one, right? We've fallen 24%. Now we're bouncing off of that. So that's totally consistent with the downturn. Big corrections, bear market, totally consistent with the cyclical downturn. All of our good leading indexes nailed that call. 100%. It was a bullseye. Could they be wrong in not seeing a business cycle recovery here? Sure. Like anything's possible. This is not a perfect science at all. But in looking at the history that we have, a century or so, looking at the logic that we have, I haven't even touched on the world economy, but let me just stipulate for a second, it doesn't look good. It's all cycling down. So with all of that stuff, it is pretty improbable that there is a soft landing on the radar or on the edge of our radar that we're just not seeing at all. And somehow the market is having a view of that we're not. That doesn't seem there. And I'm looking for it, right? Could we be wrong? The most bullish thing you could say, I think, is that, hey, there's still jobs growth. But when you look in there, there's all kinds of structural shifts going on in there and mismatches of skills and on and on and on that and our forward-looking leading employment indicators are weak. They haven't turned up. So when I look at all that, I'm like, hey, I can't in good conscience say, oh yeah, let's start doing risk on. There's no evidence from our cyclical vantage point to say that. So having said all that, I have to answer my own question and say, looks like a bear market rally.
Yeah, well, that's certainly exactly what people are wanting to hear on this podcast.
All right.
Ultimately, I mean, not financial advice. Yeah. This is long-term views, just our own opinions. But it is an investing podcast, and I know you're talking with clients. So always curious, it looks like doom and gloom. It doesn't look like this is the beginning of the next bull market. You're looking at things like unemployment indicators, which, once you dig into, they're actually maybe not as rosy as you think. So in terms of asset allocation, can you talk broadly on how clients are thinking about positioning their portfolios accordingly going into these kind of headwinds?
Yeah, I mean, by and large, look, it's a lot of assets are actually, more leaning toward the hard landing scenario, with the exception of equities and broad brushstrokes, right? So, that it's difficult for that divergence to persist. It can persist for a couple months, sure, totally. And probably just long enough to sucker people in. That's how the market works.
Or election cycles and things like this, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of that. But probably here's the one thing I want to share, and it's not complicated. We've talked about leading indexes. We've talked about central banks. And so we have these so-called long leading indexes. Now, a distinction of a long leading index is it's leading by a few quarters, not one or two quarters, but more than that. Again, this is not there's no precision here, but I'm talking about general relationships. Equities are a short leading indicator. If I look at all of the examples of all the turning points all over the place, across space and time, internationally, at home, as far back as we see, they tend to be shorter leading indicators. They're good ones at cycle troughs, particularly. So if you see a cycle trough, yeah, you want to go risk on, which is why this fear of missing out and people are jumping on this, right? So those long leading indicators we have for 22 economies around the world. So all the big developed nations and all the major emerging markets, including China, India, and even Russia. Okay. And those long leading indicators have never been as weak as they are without a global recession. Just full stop. Separately, we monitor the diffusion, the percentage, in other words, of central banks which are tightening rates. And so while the long leading 22 country long leading index is coming down to a reading that we don't see outside of a global recession, the proportion of central banks which are raising rates has never been this high. And as far as we know, monetary policy works with long and variable lags. It takes a while to propagate through, right? So, when the mortgage rate moves, then it has the impact on this and that and activity, or when the IPO doesn't happen, or the second round of funding or whatever, then it pushes out because it affects all these dominoes down the line. And so that's why you have the long and variable lags. The market may react very fast in the hope that something is happening, but then the actual activity then has to react to the change in rates or whatever. So you've got everybody slamming on the brakes when already all the drivers of the cycle are jerking to the downside. That's not a great combination. So it makes any individual country's circumstances have a kind of a tougher backdrop. Okay, so that's some kind of insight that comes up from looking at literally 100 different cyclical indexes around the world.
Yeah, well, that is great stuff. And Lakshman, I know we're bumping up against the time. I could talk to you for hours about this stuff, but I'll link ECRI and your Twitter and all of the other things we mentioned in this conversation, which was fantastic. But where can my listeners find out more about you, or where would you like to send them?
Yeah, well, businesscycle.com is our website, or I try to, if I'm thinking or seeing something and kind of just want to pop it out there for the ongoing cycle discussion, go to @businesscycle on Twitter. And that's about the extent of, it kind of propagates out from there, but
Awesome.
That's an easy way to keep an eye on this.
Well, great to have you on again. As usual, just dropping tons and tons of knowledge bombs, and I'm sure my listeners will really love it. So thank you so much.
Always a pleasure. Let's do it again. In a couple quarters, we'll do it again, and everything will have changed.
Sounds great. There you have it. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate your support. Show notes, transcript, links, and more can be found on our website at altassetallocation.com. If you'd be so kind, please share this with anyone you think might be interested or get some value from this conversation. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out. I'm always happy to hear them. Lastly, if you're on YouTube, please like the video or subscribe to the channel. If you're listening to the audio version of this, please subscribe to the podcast and or leave a review. This really helps more people find the podcast, and I really appreciate it. Thanks again, and hope you have a fantastic day. Happy investing.